You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 303 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Back to a solo show today after a week of interviews, so I want to catch up on the news from last week the best I can on today's show. Of course, most of the time will be spent on discussing the happenings in Venezuela, whether you want to call that a regime change, a coup, or just an uprising by an opposition to the communist government there. Very important developments going on in that country with some big geopolitical implications, of course, as well. So I want to go through that news, really highlight kind of what we know so far, what moves different countries and organizations have made, and then, you know, what maybe is coming here in the future. For those of you who could take, the time to share the show, I really appreciate when you do that. The best place to find it is libertarianinstitute.org. The show and my daily news roundup are featured on that site on the homepage. You know, the show's on all the different podcatchers and everything like that. So if you're on one that, you could do a rating and review, I appreciate it when you guys do that. And then, of course, there's the Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I don't do a whole lot of bonus content, but I do put some stuff out. You'll have access to that. I have some other things like old collections of articles and news roundups that I want to put together for everyone. And you'll get access to that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus if you donate to the show. All right, here we go. Starting off with some things going on in the United States before we get to the Venezuela stuff. The Pentagon has announced a big weapons buy. This is from Boeing. They're paying $2.46 billion for 19 Poseidon anti-submarine spy aircraft. These are high-tech aircraft that I think do not only ground surveillance, but they also look for submarines in different locations. I haven't seen any reporting yet on the actual need of these planes, what they're used for, if they really fit into the kind of warfare the U.S. is currently fighting. As you'll see in the next article I'll talk about, that is something you definitely have to question. But one reason you would think that the anti-Trump media would be all over this is, of course, Trump's acting Secretary of Defense, the head of the Pentagon, is a longtime Boeing executive. So here you have a man, the head of a government agency, making the choice to spend $2.46 billion on a spy plane. Now, this guy will say, well, I've, recused myself on situations dealing with Boeing. But we all know that whoever is making this decision is certainly an employee of a man in charge, Patrick Shanahan, is the acting Secretary of Defense. And people understand how the game's played. If you, pick, companies that your boss used to work for and has a vested interest in, then it's probably going to play out well for you when it, comes time for promotion. But it might not play out so well if you make the difficult decision and you go with a different company, or, just decide that the Pentagon really doesn't need these planes. So much potential for corruption yet, but very little attention paid to it. When I wake up this morning and I scroll through the news feeds, I see all these stories about, Roger Stone being indicted and what that means for Donald Trump. And that's certainly something I will get to on the show. But right now, all we have is an indictment and then Roger Stone's, early statements about that. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot there. Definitely no proof of collusion yet. But, even more publicized than the Pentagon $2.4 billion buy is the fact that Steve Martin played, apparently this guy on SNL the night before. And this is something that CNN apparently deems newsworthy, and they're writing stories on that. And yet there's so little focus on, these major weapon buys going on right now at the Pentagon, and the fact that, the Secretary of Defense, the acting Secretary of Defense is a, former, Boeing executive for many years, decades. One of the reasons that, we need, the media to really scrutinize weapon buys and actually look at the weapons that are being produced and if they're effective on the battlefield that the United States is fighting in. And as much as I don't think that battlefield should always exist, you would think that the Pentagon would still want to design effective weapons for the wars we're fighting. We have this case, POGO, the Project for Government Oversight, fantastic organization most of the time, has a detailed report on the problems with the Zumwalt class of destroyers. Now, I've talked about this ship on the past and really highlighting its major failure, that you have a destroyer, and this, kind of special feature of this destroyer was supposed to be the gun. That was a 155 millimeter round that was supposed to be fired pretty rapidly. You could keep a ton of ammunition on board the ship, so you could lay down, a lot of bullets, and this is the effective way to fight a battle. I think the original range of the gun was supposed to be 100 nautical miles. And then, the ship currently doesn't have a gun. What this POGO report does, though, is it goes through the complete history of the development of this ship and shows not only why the mistakes were made, but then, the incremental changes along the way where the, costs were raised and the expectations were lowered. So in the report, I think it identifies a couple big problems, two that I really want to talk about. The first is just kind of how this ship was contracted to be built. It ends up going to two separate kind of weapons makers, different companies. One port is in Mississippi, one port is in Maine. For the lobbying reasons and the, jobs reasons, it's important for it to be structured this way. So you have parts coming in from all over the country, but you end up sending it to two different weapons makers. So of course there ends up being problems there. But also the Congress and the Pentagon don't have a lot of oversight and give the weapons makers a lot of autonomy on what actually goes into the ships. The second problem is that this ship, they want to insert like 10 or 11 new, like really groundbreaking technologies into it. And so, I talk about the gun. They focus a lot on the stealth capabilities of the ship. The size of the hull, how it works, the fact that the ship could lower itself a little bit into the water. And so trying to cram all of that into one ship, a problem that we've seen in the past with the F-35, means that the ship really doesn't end up being able to do anything, just like the F-35 isn't really an effective fighter, bomber, close air support, or anything. I also want to point out here how, with very little notice from the public, what happens to the ship is, it goes from having a range of 100 nautical miles to then 90 to 75. And then, the ship was supposed to have a small crew, and then the operating costs, from having a smaller crew is supposed to offset the high cost of the ship. Well, the crew increases from 75 men to 100 to 150 to 175. The amount of ammo the ship is supposed to be able to carry goes from 700 rounds to 500 to 400 to 300 up, and then it doesn't actually end up having a gun. There's actually no plan, by the way, for what the hell they're going to do for this, massive destroyer that's, weaponless right now. The original plan, the Pentagon was looking at two different sources. The Congress watched both of those. They're talking about putting missiles on it, but there's a lot of logistical problems with trying to put the, missiles on this destroyer. So that's really not an option either. And they really don't know what they're going to do with this ship. In the article, they point out that it helped rescue, I guess, like a fishing boat off the coast of Maine, but it was built to be a warship, not a little rescue boat. And then, of course, while all the good numbers are going down and down and down, the cost is going up and up and up. It's going to cost, I believe, over $25 billion, when it's all said and done here. It was supposed to originally deliver, I believe 36 ships, and the final number is going to be 3. The Zumwalt is the most complete of the 3. It's a Zumwalt class destroyer, but the USS Zumwalt is the one that's the most complete. There is another ship that's on its way. And then you have the Lyndon Johnson is supposed to be the 3rd. And I don't even know if they really started building that one. They've actually had to take several parts from the uncompleted ships and put them in the Zumwalt because it's broken down 4 or 5 times so far. So it's a massive failure. The report does an excellent job of providing all the details. If you're one of those war nerds out there that really likes to understand why all the parts don't work for what reasons. But overall, it just shows the failures. Now we have the Pentagon looking at venturing on another very expensive project. This would be to be able to deploy small nuclear reactors along with U.S. troops to different bases we set up around the world. The article points out that, whenever the U.S. was most entrenched in Iraq, I believe this was 2008, there was something like 900,000 gallons of fuel needed that year. This is very expensive, very difficult to import. So the idea is to put a small nuclear reactor there and basically set up a town. Well, I mean, not only does this sound, kind of like the plot of a sci-fi novel now, where the U.S. sets up a nuclear reactor somewhere and the rebels have to go in and destroy the reactor to take down the U.S. military post or something crazy like that. You would think this would become a pretty dangerous target, to have this there. But, maybe logistically for a reason I really don't understand it. However, looking at how, the F-35 and this Zumwalt class destroyer has developed, we shouldn't have any realistic expectations that this nuclear reactor is going to be the safest product on the market, the most efficient, that's going to come in anywhere near the budget it was supposed to or in the time frame it was. And so, while it'd be nice to think about how, we could have this reactor that we could deploy in 3 days and have it out in 7, and it's going to be safe and efficient, all that, it's probably not. I also read a story I thought was interesting, and that is just the Marine suicide for active duty Marines was at a 10-year high in 2018. And so, as I just mentioned, the U.S. Army was most active in Iraq in 2008, and I think the Marine Corps was a large portion of the surge there. Likewise, 2018 was a pretty busy year. 2018. First years of the Trump administration, he has certainly turned the dial up on most of the wars the U.S. was fighting. And I just thought that, this story kind of made me reflect on, why is that happening? And then kind of realizing that, we've, escalated in Somalia. We continue along in Yemen. 2017 and 2018 were busy years for the United States in the fight against ISIS. And that has since settled down a little bit, but you recently had, 4 Americans killed by an Islamic State bomb in Syria. And certainly, the fight against different jihadist groups across Africa continues as well. And so, I just wanted to take the time to point out, because there's so much criticism of Donald Trump for not being enough of a hawk that we actually forget he's more hawkish than his predecessor in a lot of ways. All right, Venezuela. Here we had a situation where, according to the AP, so I want to just kind of give the complete narrative in timeline order. This story broke after most of the rest of the details I'm going to go over. But according to the AP, you have this guy, Juan Guaido, and he is the leader of the Opposition National Assembly in Venezuela. This is essentially a second Congress that has set itself up in opposition to the Maduro government. And the National Assembly claims the constitutional authority that, the government in the elections in Venezuela have been illegitimate, and therefore they could appoint an interim president and assume power until real elections could be had. So that's kind of the, in Venezuela situation. Now, this guy, Guaido, smuggles himself out of Venezuela and goes and meets in Colombia and in Brazil with what is called the Lima Group of 13 Latin American nations, and basically convinces them that he has the opposition in Venezuela organized enough right now that he could declare himself interim president. And so not only have those 13 countries gotten on board, but many other of the Western nations have been on board now, the United States as well. Guaido had meetings, secret meetings, like I said, in Colombia, Brazil, and in Washington, D.C. He did go to an American college and does have ties to the State Department. People are really pushing these details, saying that, it's clear that he's some kind of American asset and this is an American coup or regime change effort. I don't think that is entirely clear yet. So then you have the big day when, you have all these countries make their public announcement that they are recognizing Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela and are no longer recognizing the Maduro government as any legitimate authority in Venezuela. And then he goes ahead and declares himself interim president as well. Certainly, I guess I want to take a break here to talk about just my experience looking at the developments on the day, was that there did seem to be a pretty coordinated effort among U.S. officials and U.S. propaganda sources to bat this move. Voice of America was putting out tons of different videos and just little stories, mainly focusing on the size of the support for Guaido. You had Bolton, Pompeo, both, and I believe Pence as well, quickly jump on board and bat Trump's decision here. Of course, Marco Rubio was one of the first on board. And then interesting, I haven't seen this in the past before. I think it just more symbolizes a changing of the times, whereas rather than you would maybe have like the Washington Post be the focus on who they recognize being the government of Venezuela, you have Facebook and Instagram de-verifying Maduro's accounts and then verifying Guaido's accounts on their social media sites. So very interesting to see those companies quickly taking a stand. Well, I guess that one company, because I think Facebook owns Instagram. Oh, and by the way, just kind of a quick tangent mention, for those of you who use Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp, Facebook is going to be merging the messengers there, I believe, through all three, so they would be the same system. They will be independent apps still, but it'll be all one messaging system. I'm not sure what that means for the security and encryption standards on the different sites, but certainly something, to take note of if you're passing information that you want to remain private. Since the announcement, we have this number of 20 people killed in protest. It's not clear at all to me that all these people have died on one side of the conflict. It seems like, there's some pretty good documented evidence that I've seen shared out by Mats Blumenthal that, the opposition groups to the Maduro government are responsible for some of the violence. However, there's clear video evidence as well of the Maduro government oppressing people. There's this story that you have Russian mercenaries basically protecting Maduro now. I don't think it's yet clear what side the military is going to take. I read a story that the Venezuelan military envoy to the United States has defected and is now, recognizing the interim president as the leader of Venezuela. However, I don't think there's been a big military-wide either decision or announcement as to, who the military of Venezuela will continue to support. But, like I said, there's this report, it was in Reuters, that a source claims that there are Russian mercenaries helping protect Maduro. Now, I imagine that if these were Americans that were deployed, they may be called peacekeepers, but there were some kind of just context details of the story that gave me pause. And so even when I posted it on Immersion News and in my news roundup, I did highlight that, this is only a claim, that, the report says that there are Russian mercenaries there, but it doesn't necessarily say it's from a Russian organization or a Russian company. And so just like you had Americans running around in Yemen carrying out assassinations for the UAE, it's not immediately clear to me that, this organization or whatever Russians are alleged to be defending Maduro are doing so at behest or, at least being allowed to by the Russian government. However, Russia is one of the nations, along with, the expected, kind of left-wing communist nations, Nicaragua and Cuba, coming out in support of the Maduro government. I don't think China has either made a big announcement yet. A couple places we will have to see things play out still, and I wanted to talk about this real quick, is, Venezuela has offshore assets, whether it's Citgo or, their gold in the Bank of England, that they're claiming the Maduro government is trying to recall now that they have officially broken diplomatic ties with, many of the countries like the United States. I'm not quite sure what the situation with Citgo is. There's a ton of court cases and everything, and I don't understand all the legality there. But you have the U.S. and UK saying that, no, these assets are now in the possession of the interim government of Venezuela. So that's a way that, these things can really play out. And, the U.S. and the UK could have a huge influence on what goes on in Venezuela without even introducing any foreign forces to the country. Yeah, so Maduro had announced a cut to ties with the United States and gave the U.S. envoy to Venezuela 72 hours to leave. The U.S. has withdrawn all non-emergency personnel from. The U.S. has said that they're going to ignore the Maduro order, and I believe the interim president has said that, he, under his authority as leader of Venezuela, the Americans can stay. Not quite sure how, that portion is all going to play out. I would guess that Maduro isn't going to try to violently arrest the American diplomats if they remain in the country, but it could certainly be a situation where it's difficult for them to leave their embassy. All right, the last note here, and this is, I think, the worst sign as far as the actual news that something bad could happen and the U.S. could get involved in Venezuela, and that is Elliot Abrams has been appointed the envoy to Venezuela. Now, I believe, and this is as far as I've been able to tell by looking at different news stories, that the envoy, unlike an ambassador, would not have to be approved by Congress. And I'm not even sure if the appointment would have to be made by Trump. Pompeo made the announcement as Secretary of State. So, because I know there's a history here where Abrams was looked at for either Secretary of State or NSA and was pretty immediately passed on after very rude statements he made about Donald Trump were made, known to Donald Trump. So, not sure if Trump knew that Pompeo was appointing Abrams here, but he's a longtime hawk, a very dangerous neocon, and certainly will not help peace and, would encourage regime change, I believe. And possibly, armed U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in Venezuela is just what is actually going on. Is it this like an organized kind of grassroots uprising where you actually had an opposition to the Maduro government form up here? One of the kind of long-standing problems with the opposition to Maduro has been very fractured. They can't agree on kind of who they are, what they're all about. I'm sure there are some factions that are probably more totalitarian than the Maduro government, right-wing versus left-wing fascism. It could be very different, but it's all, terrible in its own ways. To, more moderate, I probably doubt that, there's a very strong, like, libertarian bent among anybody. And, maybe they would take some of the ownership of companies or, different sectors of the Venezuelan economy and allow it to, exist on the quote unquote free market. But there's probably going to be a ton of corruption. So I'm not optimistic that, there's going to be a free market arise in Venezuela from this opposition. Now, there could very well be a government that takes hold that's at least more moderate. And while it is, crony capitalist, kind of government is, less corruption and more freedom and more wealth for the people of Venezuela. Not sure, where it falls on that range. The Maduro government's pretty bad, so it's probably hard not to be an improvement. But, as we've seen in places in the Middle East and, Afghanistan, whenever, the central government falls apart, it may not just, be easy for a new, better government to form up. There may be a lot of pain in the middle. So, I don't know how, U.S. directed this is and what, hand the United States plays that this was, a U.S. regime change in the, the style of what happened in, Ukraine, Libya, the attempted regime change in Syria or in Iraq. It's kind of hard to say at this point. I don't think we have enough information. Hopefully, the great journalists who go out there and really hammer down what happened and when, like Gareth Porter, where I know like Matt Blumenthal does pretty good work about what's going on in Venezuela, gets out there and, hammers out these details for us so we can really understand what happened in the country and why it happened. I will say, and this is the final thing before I move on, I was surprised by the lack of violence in Venezuela after this uprising sparked. That to me seems to mean that it didn't really kind of pan out and that the coup is not going to, bear fruit and Maduro will retain power in the country. But like I said, I think these offshore assets and kind of what happens in the international community will be important and play a role in what's to come in Venezuela. And I think that generally sides in favor of the opposition there. All right, Congress passes the law here. This is just like a little stupid story I want to throw in on today's show, that basically prevents the United States from using any funds to withdraw from NATO. So I guess this would mean now that you had to have a national congressional law, to get the U.S. to withdraw or back out of NATO. Very unfortunate because, I think one of Donald Trump's better instincts, although he certainly hasn't made any progress in withdrawing the U.S. from NATO and NATO has expanded under the Trump administration, is to question the NATO alliance, which would be a good thing. There's always good stories coming out. I'm going to link to one by Dub Bandow in the show notes page about why it's time to leave NATO. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the INF treaty is going to be saved, and the evil John Bolton wins another one, destroying another treaty that helped prevent nuclear proliferation in the world. You have this Russian missile. Russia claims its range is 400 kilometers. The U.S. says it's longer at 660 and is therefore a violation of the INF treaty. The U.S. is demanding full access to the missile. Russia has put it on display, shown pictures of it. When it did, the U.S. and the mainstream media here portrayed it as almost, I think, Russia flaunting the INF treaty, when in reality it was Russia trying to hold the U.S. in the INF treaty. And now it looks like we'll be out of that by early February. So very disappointing. And of course, fear of nuclear proliferation going on from here as it suddenly puts Europe back in the range of potential land-based nuclear missiles from Russia. There's this issue with space missiles. They have this program. I want to just talk about this briefly for kids. CNN 10, I believe it's called. And I don't know, some doofus is on there talking about different news stories. And I've noticed a heavy amount of U.S. weapons being discussed in these stories, including they did a little segment glorifying Raytheon and their missiles. But they also talked about, these space-based missile defense systems on it. And of course, nothing skeptical. So just disappointing in the crap that CNN is feeding the children of this country. But, to get back on it, the U.S. wants to set up these radar systems and I guess potentially put missiles in space to intercept Russian missiles that would be headed to the United States. Would, I'm sure, be the alleged purpose, or North Korea or whoever the hell else, China. As I talked about with past projects, on this show, like the Zumwalt, it's probably going to end up costing way too much and not doing what it should. The U.S. missile defense systems that we have now are not very good and have cost a ton of money. So, this is a very dangerous play, though, because it takes things a step further. We talk about, at one time we had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and that means both the United States and Russia weren't making missile defense systems. Well, we got out of that and spent a ton of money making a missile defense system, and Russia now has a missile that bypasses that system 100% of the time, so it's crap anyways. So now we're talking about weaponizing space. This is going to, again, cost us a ton of money, and who knows if it's even going to be able to prevent a Russian nuclear attack, and it's just going to open up a whole new window of potential weaponry, just like withdrawing from the INF treaty will. So as much as, we hear Donald Trump, kind of vocalize that he wants to get along with Russia, he wants to get along with China, he doesn't want a weapons race, every step that he's actually taking in his administration, expanding NATO, withdrawing from the INF treaty, building these space-based missile defense systems, are all entering the U.S. into a weapons race that I'm not sure we could win. As well as provoking Russia with all these efforts, we're also provoking China, sailing 2 U.S. warships through the Strait of Taiwan. In the past, and I'll just briefly explain real quick why this is a big deal. China claims that Taiwan is part of China, and they're just kind of in rebellion area right now, whereas Taiwan claims to be an independent nation. If Taiwan is an independent nation, then they can give the U.S. authority to sail their warships through the Taiwan Strait. If Taiwan is part of China, then the Taiwan Strait, which is a small body of water that exists between the Chinese mainland and the island of Taiwan, then China could then prevent the U.S. from using the Taiwan Strait. So it's kind of like a show of force kind of move where, at the UN and on paper, the U.S. will say, oh yeah, we support the one China policy, but then we go ahead and flaunt the one China policy by sailing our warships through the Taiwan Strait. In the past, that this, typically, I think under the Obama administration, happened about once a year. Now we've had about 4 in the past 4 months, or 3, in the past 4 months, and 4 in the past year. So there does seem to be an uptick here, and China, as I've talked about in the past on the show, has been really making a global geopolitical effort to rally more countries to kind of signing on to their one China policy. So, this could be a dispute that we see emerge in the future between the United States and China. Last week, we had a good amount of Israeli strikes in Syria, pretty heavy bombing. We haven't seen that in quite some time, probably not since the Israeli F-16 got shot down. Israel claims that Iranian forces launched a missile into Israel that was intercepted by the Israeli Iron Dome system, and that's what prompted the attack. Most of the missiles were shot down by the Syrian military. Apparently, Israel is targeting the Syrian air defense systems. They shoot down the different missiles or planes firing in Syrian airspace. Israel was able to take out a couple of these positions and kill over 10. I saw numbers between 11 and 17 Syrian soldiers and a couple civilians in the attack. They're apparently using these kamikaze drones to bypass the Syrian missile defense system. So interesting new battlefield technology that I just want to mention. In some good news, there does seem to be some progress in peace talks both with North Korea and Afghanistan. We had a delegation from North Korea travel to the United States. Afterwards, Trump said, the talks went well. It looks like we're going to have another meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un in late February. Of course, the unfortunate part here is that this is going to be a gigantic mess, as the media is going to then bash, any kind of détente with North Korea. However, maybe the government will be shut down again. Everybody will be way too distracted to care. It'll be interesting to see how the media cycle unfolds this time. But as far as it goes, getting good signs from both Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un heading into this meeting. The progress with the Taliban, it seems that there has been guarantees, quote unquote, because we're talking about the U.S. government and the Taliban here, probably two of the most untrustworthy actors on the planet, that the Taliban will not allow Afghanistan to become a safe haven for terrorists, and in exchange, the U.S. will eventually leave Afghanistan. And this is significant progress made in talks between the United States and the Taliban. Apparently, there's a senior Taliban, the political leader of the Taliban, is the title the news story gave him, and he's going to be traveling to Qatar to continue these talks with the United States. Of course, as well as talks may be going between the United States and the Taliban still refuse to talk to the Afghan government. And so what progress between the United States and the Taliban actually mean for Afghan civilians as far as, ending the violence in that country, I really don't know. Even if the United States leaves, that country could get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. And especially when you have developments like this, you have Hekmatyar, the, legendary Afghan brutal warlord, now throwing his hat in the ring to become president of that country. So not only just a symbol of how much the U.S. war there has failed there over their 17 years, that you may have a warlord in charge of that country or winning a U.S.-backed election soon, but also that, the Taliban won't even seal a deal with, the U.S.-backed government there. There was a pretty major attack by the Taliban, on the Afghan army. That's worth mentioning. 100 plus killed on the Afghan army side there by the Taliban. So it shows that they're able to carry out pretty major attacks, and I believe it was against an Afghan army base. All right, and then there's a whole bunch of instability going on in Africa. And I'm just going to mention all these stories, and then I'll link to things in the show notes page for people who want to read more about each one. And if it becomes more significant, of course, I'll talk about a show again in the future. Protests in Congo continue. They're demanding that President Bashar stand down. It seems like, the crackdown continues to go on. At least 40 people have been killed in violence there, including children and, innocent civilians. I believe a doctor was killed by the government, so that's certainly problematic. Bashar seems to be going around the region looking for support from regional powers like Egypt. In Zimbabwe, protests continue. Of course, I had talked about the coup d'etat there and the change of power. It seems like a very much, meet the new boss, same as the old boss situation. The internet had been turned off. I believe the Supreme Court of the country got turned back on. But again, you're looking at, military on the street and suppression of the people there, looking for a government that is not going to oppress them. In Libya, you have a situation where the Haftar-backed forces have now declared the UN envoy an opponent. But in good news, you have this situation where I guess the various warring governments of Libya have agreed to build this major port in Libya. So this could be potential future money coming into the country. If it ever sees some stability, I'm sure it would be a huge deal. Several peacekeepers have been killed in Mali. Of course, much of the civil war going on there is a result of blowback from the destabilization created by the Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama intervention in Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi. So you now have Al-Qaeda groups, AQIM, I think primarily running around in Mali. They killed 10 peacekeepers in one attack. And then, that civil war claimed 2 more peacekeepers, I believe from Sri Lanka. And then maybe a couple from Burkina Faso were injured when their vehicle ran over a landmine. So another sad situation where you have, people that are just, probably doing their jobs, getting killed out there in Mali by a civil war created by U.S. destabilization. And then in Somalia, the U.S. said they're no longer going to disclose the results of their airstrikes there. So just gonna bomb and kill people and not tell the truth. Although they probably lied anyways, because every single report is, we killed 50 al-Shabaab, we killed 60 al-Shabaab, we killed 10 al-Shabaab, but never, admitting that they killed any civilians. As a very good recent article by Lucy Steigenwald points out, I believe this was published at Reason, any military-aged male is often considered a militant anyways. And so as long as you're able to blow up a bunch of men and none of them, are sucking their thumbs, you call them all al-Shabaab militants, and nobody in the U.S. is ever going to go out and investigate or care anyways. And so they just get away with, publishing whatever numbers they want. So maybe not publishing the numbers will be better, than the crap that they will have published. But either way, it's worth noting that they're saying they're not going to do that. And we've seen a huge uptick in strikes under President Trump, I believe 47 in 2018. And then there's just some reports of Ethiopia gaining firefights with al-Shabaab in southern Somalia. And of course, this could just present problems in the region and draw al-Shabaab into Ethiopia. All right, that's where I'll wrap up today's show. A little bit of a long one, but I hope you all enjoyed it. Like I said, I had a lot of news from last week I wanted to cover. There's still more stuff that I'll get to later in the week. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you are, think about sharing it. libertarianinstitute.org, foreign policy focus.libsyn.com, minds.com/immersion news. And of course, Immersion News is the name of my news website. Updates coming to that soon that I'm really excited about. I think I'm going to take that site to the, next level. And it's really going to be something special in a couple months here. If you want to really support the show, patreon.com/foreign policy focus. And, I don't know, do anything else you think be helpful. Thanks, guys.